Times have changed, and most producers from the mid-'60s haven't really grown with the changes. They're not able to do what producers now can do. There's a new modern sound, and he doesn't have it.
No.
His time's passed. We wanted to work with Phil because I mean, the guy is a legend, and we thought it'd be a very good idea to work with a legend. And you never know when it is be his last project. And plus, we didn't really know how difficult it is to work with the guy before we stepped into it. We found out.
You know, like when before I wanted to work with him 100%, and I was gung-ho for the project, but he came off differently. He seemed more positive and more able. And when I got into the studio, I found him to be like a helpless little boy or something, like a very helpless person. He didn't know what to do. And that just stifles creativity when you just hang around in agony and frustration and stomp your foot and say, oh, what are we going to do? And all. You know, that doesn't bring out anything in anybody.
I guess faced with the project, he was very enthused. And then when she gets to that all of a sudden now it's the time, I guess then he must get a bit nervous about that all of a sudden it's getting near the time where he has to put out a project which is going to be criticized.
He seemed like a man.
Then, you know, then it becomes very hard. It gets harder and harder for him to finish the project from the time of pre-production.
He seemed like a man walking his last mile doing our record, you know, that grim.
Hi, this is Ronnie Spector, and you're listening to Rodney on the Rock on KROQ FM.
Started off as Ronnie Bennett with her sister and her cousin. Phil Spector called them the Ronettes.
He wanted somebody to sing backup, singing from in New York. And we jumped to the chance. And we called him. And we said, we sing backup and stuff. So we met him a couple of days later at a place called Mirror Sound on 57th Street here in New York. And first meeting was just him and us, the three of us. He was sitting at a piano. And he just said, sing what you usually sing. And so we started singing little three-part harmony stuff. He said, well, do you know anything like, like any of the, like rock and roll songs? And I said, well, I know Frankie Lyman stuff by heart, and all that stuff, Little Anthony. He said, well, let me hear it. And I started saying, why do birds sing so gay? He said, that's the voice. Well, I think Phil was a very normal person at the very beginning of his career, just very dedicated and very determined. But as time went on, they started writing about him being a genius. And then he said, yeah, I am a genius. This is the thoughts that I was living with him, that I was thinking, because I was watching him. And then they would say he's the mad genius, so he became the mad genius. I mean, it was anything they wrote about him. He's a recluse, so he became a recluse. I mean, this is my opinion. I think if Phil hadn't read anything about himself, I think he would still be the same. But that sort of destroyed him because he became a replicate of everything he read about himself. I wouldn't say he's mad. A lot of times I think he's pretending to be, because I've seen him straight, like we're going someplace, and then I've seen him act that weird way of his. So a lot of it is intentional. A lot of it may be mad, but a lot of it is certainly intentional to let people wonder about what is this guy all about. I think he's always wanted attention. And I think he's also always wanted to be an artist on his own. He just didn't have the talent or the voice. Because after all, he started out with the teddy bear, so it shows you right there he wanted to be a performer himself. But he couldn't because he didn't have the talent for that. But he had the talent for producing and writing, so he did that. I think he's not working now, but partly because of his pride. And he's afraid because he doesn't, if it's not going to be a hit, you know, he's just like, he's afraid. Because he did a few things with the Ramones and Cher, and they weren't successful. So I think he's afraid, like the name that he has, he wants to maintain as being that genius and that mad genius. And I think he's actually afraid to go back in the studio. Afraid that it may not become a hit. And people would start saying he's not such a genius, and he wants to keep that title.
Well, Phil Spector is really the voice of a whole era of American popular music. This was the era that followed upon the first advent of rock and roll in the early 60s. After the rockabillys and the hard rockers and the Little Richard types and so forth had sort of been wiped out by a big wave of disapprobation, a moral panic, you could call it, symbolized by the payola scandal. The slate was sort of wiped clean, and rock had to resume on a different basis. It was this great hole, this declivity, and Phil Spector filled that space. The space between Elvis and the Beatles was Phil Spector's. Well, of course, Phil was famous for a thing he called the wall of sound. And recently I went back and I reviewed Spector's records, which are now available in a big compendious collection. And I was astounded, I was shocked at how horrible these records really are. They're a monument to what we call in America schlock. Phil Spector represents schlock, which is a nice mouth-filling, salivating sort of Yiddish American New York word, which I suppose you would translate into British intellectual terms as kitsch, but kitsch is cold and sort of an ice-pick word that is snobbish and intellectual. Schlock means something very vulgar, very gross. It's really fascinating in a way because it's one of these things that fascinates you sort of through horror rather than delight, you know. I mean, when you first hear these records, you're sort of awestruck. I mean, was there ever anything this blatant, this vulgar, this loud, this gross, this calculating, this commercial? I mean, is it possible that this legendary figure actually produced these horrible records?